Tonight we wander through marble shadows and perfumed air, along the palace walls where roses climb like painted flames against the stone. You step softly, the echo of your sandals sounding far too loud for this late hour, but it hardly matters, only the night watch, a drowsy monk or two, and the roses themselves are awake to notice you. Their petals catch the moonlight like silken lanterns, unfolding as though the darkness coaxes them open. The scent hangs heavy, sweet, and just a little sharp, like the memory of wine you shouldn't have finished last night. You breathe in, already lulled into that quiet strangeness where history feels alive again. And here's the reality check. If you'd actually been hired as a gardener in the Byzantine court, you probably wouldn't have survived long. The pay was low, the gossip was vicious, and the emperor's taste in roses was so exacting that one wilting bud could cost you your job or worse, your head. But since you're only strolling through in imagination, you're safe. At least until you trip over a watering jug and embarrass yourself in front of a guard. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The roses glisten as though they've been polished, their dew catching every flicker of torchlight along the walls. You brush your hand along a stem, careful not to snag a thorn, and realize these flowers are more than decoration. In Byzantium, roses meant status, power, and the illusion that man could bend nature to imperial command. The emperor expected roses blooming at the right feasts, in the right shades, and in the right profusion. And you, poor soul, are one of the anonymous hands behind that delicate miracle. A mainstream fact first. Byzantine chroniclers describe palace gardens as wonders equal to their churches, the roses planted not just for fragrance but to showcase wealth and divine favor. A wall without roses would be like a banquet without wine, it would have felt embarrassingly bare. But then there are the fringe tidbits whispered among gardeners. Some claimed the first roses at the Byzantine palace had been blessed with holy water and could never wilt, which, frankly, seems optimistic given Constantinople's unpredictable weather. Others swore the roses themselves could whisper prayers back to the Virgin Mary if the gardener tended them in silence. Imagine trying to weed in absolute quiet, with only your stomach growling as background noise. Historians still argue whether those palace roses were truly cultivated varieties imported from Persia, or simply hardy Mediterranean stock coaxed into elegance with enough manure and patience. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but you don't have the luxury of waiting centuries for an academic answer. You have pruning shears in hand, and an overseer checking that every bloom shines like it belongs in paradise. You lean close, and the petals feel impossibly soft, like folds of silk. Their scent drifts toward the palace windows, carrying into the chambers of nobles who will never know the ache in your shoulders from dragging water jars, or the scratches left behind by thorns. For them, the roses are effortless. For you, they're blisters and sleepless nights. But it's worth it, or so you tell yourself, because one evening stroll like this, when moonlight makes the blossoms shimmer as if the walls themselves breathe perfume, is enough to convince anyone they've touched a corner of eternity. Your footsteps follow the long stretch of stone, where the roses climb higher than your head, their tendrils twining with the cracks between blocks. Here, where mortar has loosened, the roots sink deep, clutching the palace walls like a lover too stubborn to let go. You pause, half in awe, half in dread, realizing you'll be the one tasked with untangling them later. At least roses, unlike courtiers, don't whisper about your mistakes behind your back. A breeze rises from the Bosporus, cool and damp, carrying the smell of saltwater that mixes oddly with the rose's sweetness. You shiver and wrap your robe tighter, muttering that if heaven had a scent, it would probably be something like this, but with fewer mosquitoes. A moth bats against a petal, tiny and frantic, as though drawn into the same trance you've fallen under. Somewhere inside the palace, a faint clang of cups signals a late feast. Perhaps the roses you watered this morning already lie crushed in goblets, their petals floating in spiced wine, destined to be gulped down by men who will never see the garden. You try not to resent them. After all, a rose that is admired only in silence still fulfills its purpose. You stop at one bloom brighter than the rest, its red glowing like spilled paint under the moon. For a heartbeat, you think it watches you back, its open petals an unblinking eye. Ridiculous, of course. But then again, in Byzantium, the line between miracle and everyday life was thinner than parchment. Who's to say roses couldn't judge you? And so you walk on, half entranced, half exhausted, with the first buds of the season promising a long year of toil. You may not survive the emperor's standards, the overseer's scoldings, or the weeds that grow faster than your patience. But for tonight, at least, you survive this stroll. The roses glow, the palace hums in silence, and you let yourself imagine that history is holding its breath just to listen. You kneel beside a low wooden bench, and there it is, the small arsenal of a Byzantine palace gardener. It doesn't look impressive, certainly not the sort of treasure displayed in the emperor's vaults, but to you, every item here feels like the difference between survival and humiliation. Wooden hoes lie stacked in a corner, their handles worn smooth by 100 tired hands. Bronze shears gleam faintly in the torchlight, their edges sharpened and resharpened until they could probably clip a pigeon's wing mid-flight, though the steward has warned you more than once not to test that theory. You reach for a clay watering jar, feeling its weight pull against your wrist. Empty, it's deceptively light, promising an easy stroll down the irrigation path. Full, it turns into a back-breaking anchor, sloshing water that soaks your sandals and bruises your shins. You mutter a quiet curse under your breath, which you immediately regret, glancing up at the palace wall as though a saint might have overheard. It strikes you how ordinary these tools are, despite the grandeur they serve. The emperor may command gilded mosaics and jewel-studded crowns, but his roses bow only to crude bronze, splintering wood, and the calluses on your hands. A mainstream fact slips in here. Archaeologists have indeed found Byzantine gardening implements remarkably similar to Roman designs, suggesting that while empires rise and fall, the business of coaxing plants from the soil doesn't bother reinventing itself. The quirky tidbit. A fellow gardener once swore by a tool he called the snail fork, essentially a bent piece of iron meant to flick snails from rose leaves without smearing them into goo. He kept it tied to his belt like a knight's sword, brandishing it proudly at every opportunity. You try not to laugh remembering it, though you also can't deny the satisfaction of watching a plump snail go sailing into the bushes. Still, there's debate among historians over how much of this equipment was standardized versus improvised. Some argue palace gardeners had official workshops turning out uniform tools stamped with imperial marks. Others suggest you cobbled together whatever worked, bits of broken pottery for scooping, chipped knives borrowed from kitchens, even a child's toy drumstick used as a soil probe. You glance at your mismatched collection and suspect the second camp may be closer to the truth. You heft the bronze shears, their cold weight settling into your palm. They're not delicate things, they squeak as they open, demanding force to snap through a stem. You position them on a branch, squeeze, and the stem gives way with a crisp crunch. For a moment, you admire your handiwork, until you realize you've snipped a perfectly good rosebud by mistake. The horror freezes in your chest. You glance around wildly, relieved no overseer has noticed. You tuck the severed bud behind your ear, hoping to pass it off as a fashion choice if anyone asks. Next to the bench rests a pair of stiff leather gloves, cracked at the knuckles. They don't quite fit, made for someone with broader hands, perhaps, but you tug them on anyway. The thorns have no mercy, and you'd rather not explain fresh scratches to your mother again. She once swore roses had spiteful souls, exacting vengeance on careless gardeners, which might explain why your cousin abandoned this job after only 3 days. You, less fortunate, are still here. Beside the gloves lies a curious device, a clay sprinkler head, perforated with tiny holes. You screw it onto a jar's mouth, tip the vessel forward, and watch as water sprays in a gentle arc. It's oddly mesmerizing, like rainfall you can summon at will. You remember overhearing two senior gardeners argue whether this invention came from the Persians or was devised right here in Constantinople. Historians still argue over the same question, which feels oddly comforting, as though even scholars share in your daily confusion. As you tidy the tools, you catch sight of the overseer's favorite implement, a whip-thin switch cut from a willow branch. Not for the roses, mind you, for the gardeners. He doesn't use it often, but its mere presence is enough to quicken your pace. You joke to yourself that perhaps this, too, counts as gardening equipment, since it does seem to keep workers sprouting faster than weeds. You line everything in order, hose leaned together like gossiping monks, shears gleaming like crooked smiles, watering jars upright in a neat row. There's satisfaction in this ritual, a sense that even if roses never bloom to perfection, at least your tools sit ready. You flex your fingers, feeling blisters sting, and imagine centuries later someone digging up these same objects, wondering if they were ceremonial or sacred. You'd love to tell them, no, just sweaty, ordinary, and occasionally snail-splattered. One last look at the bronze shears, and you tuck them into your belt, their weight oddly reassuring. Tonight you'll wander further, clip what needs clipping, and pray you don't decapitate any more promising buds. The roses may belong to the emperor, but the tools, the clumsy, awkward, squeaky tools, belong to you. And in the quiet of the garden, when moonlight brushes every blade and petal, that feels like enough. You crouch low, brushing aside a cluster of fallen petals, and your fingers sink into the dark soil. It's softer than you expect, crumbly, almost sweet-smelling, laced with flecks of straw and ash. Someone has clearly tended this patch with care, mixing in just the right ingredients to keep the roses fat and spoiled. The soil is alive in its own way, breathing beneath the moonlight, and you can't help but imagine it sighing as you disturb it. Mainstream fact time. Byzantine gardeners were masters of soil amendment, knowing full well that Constantinople's natural earth could be stingy with nutrients. To coax roses into thriving along palace walls, they hauled in composted manure, wood ash from kitchens, and sometimes even crushed oyster shells from the fish markets. You stir the dirt with your fingers and wonder if a rose can taste the sea. The quirky tidbit. Word around the garden is that some gardeners experimented with adding pigeon droppings to the mix. They swore it produced blossoms as big as a fist, though the smell was apparently memorable. One unlucky novice spread far too much near a chapel entrance, and the clergy accused him of trying to summon demons. He swore he was innocent, though you notice he was quietly transferred to work with cucumbers instead. Historians still argue whether Byzantine composting knowledge was borrowed wholesale from earlier Roman manuals or developed independently through trial and error. You think it's probably both, half from books written by men in robes, half from sweaty gardeners who never touched parchment but knew exactly what worked. You dig deeper, pulling out a worm that wriggles indignantly in your palm. You can't help but chuckle. Worms are, in a way, your secret co-workers, never paid, never praised, but always churning the soil. You tuck the little creature back and whisper a thank you, earning a funny look from the gardener across the path. Let them laugh. You'd rather befriend a worm than another snide apprentice. You gather a bucket of compost nearby, its contents steaming faintly in the cool air. The smell makes your nose wrinkle, manure, rotted leaves, and something suspiciously like fish guts. You spread it around the roses, muttering as the sticky mess clings to your sandals. Somewhere behind you, a guard coughs theatrically, as though mocking your stench. You resist the urge to fling a clod at his shiny boots. The soil clings beneath your fingernails, reminding you of the unglamorous truth. Emperors may dine under rose garlands, but their glory rests on heaps of dung. You smile wryly at the irony. History books love to gild thrones, yet forget that someone had to stir manure at midnight to make the roses bloom. You pause, wiping sweat from your forehead, and remember a story another gardener once told, a rumor that in the early days of the city, Constantine himself ordered special soil to be brought from Troy to enrich the palace gardens. Supposedly it contained the spirit of heroes, and the roses planted there bloomed redder than any others. True? Who knows? Historians still argue whether that soil story is myth or a garbled record of regular fertilizer shipments. Either way, it sounds grander than the reality squishing between your toes. Kneeling again, you sprinkle ashes at the base of a thorny bush. The grey powder drifts like ghostly snow. Ash, you know, helps balance the soil's acidity, though part of you likes to imagine it carries whispers of burned prayers from the kitchens. You picture a cook scraping charred bread into a bucket, unknowingly adding to tomorrow's roses. Everyone contributes, whether they mean to or not. You press your palm flat against the earth, feeling its damp warmth seep into your skin. This soil is a patchwork of efforts: farmer's manure, baker's ashes, fisherman's shells, your sweat. No emperor could order that alchemy into being. It requires the quiet, unseen hands of a dozen people who never meet. The roses know this. Perhaps that's why they bloom so stubbornly, as if fed by secret community. A beetle crawls over your glove, shiny and determined. You flick it off with exaggerated care, muttering that even beetles get more respect than gardeners. At least no one blames them when a rose wilts. Still, there's humor in it. You imagine some future historian holding up this soil sample in a glass vial, gravely declaring it a relic of imperial magnificence. You'd love to tell them, it was just poop, ashes, and a lot of grumbling. Your hands are filthy now, dark streaks smudging your robe, and your knees ache from crouching. You sigh, leaning back against the wall. The roses sway above you, blissfully unaware of your labor, their roots sipping greedily from the cocktail you've mixed. You wonder if they appreciate it, or if they simply demand more next season, like courtiers hungry for gifts. Either way, you'll keep stirring secrets into the soil, because that's the unspoken vow of a palace gardener: make roses bloom, no matter what goes into the ground. And so the earth settles, dark and rich, holding its mysteries. You brush your hands clean, though the smell clings stubbornly. Somewhere overhead, a rose trembles, heavy with promise, and you smile in spite of yourself. After all, it's not every day you get to feed history with dirt. You rise from the soil, brush your knees, and follow the sound of water. It's faint at first, a trickle, a murmur, but the closer you walk along the stone path, the more it builds into a rhythmic splash, like the heartbeat of the palace gardens. Roses can't survive on moonlight and prayers alone. They crave steady drinking, and in Byzantium, that meant clever channels hidden beneath marble and earth. You stoop, running your fingers over a groove in the flagstones. Water seeps there, dampening the cracks. You know the system well: aqueducts carrying snowmelt and spring water from miles away, feeding into vast underground cisterns, then slipping into narrow clay pipes that snake under the palace walls. A mainstream fact: Constantinople was famous for these cisterns. The basilica cistern alone could hold tens of thousands of tons of water, its cool darkness watched over by carved Medusa heads. Without those reservoirs, neither the city nor the roses would have survived siege or summer. You trail the sound to a small outlet, where water spills gently into a stone basin. Someone, centuries ago, shaped this fountain to look like a lion's mouth. Its teeth drip with fresh water, a comical sight considering how ferociously unthreatening it looks. You bend low, cup your hands, and sip. The water is cool, earthy, tasting faintly of clay. You grimace. It's refreshing, yes, but it has that unmistakable pipe flavor, which you decide is just another word for dust. And now the quirky tidbit: some gardeners swore that singing to the cisterns improved the water's quality. They claimed the vibrations kept the flow lively, as though water itself enjoyed a lullaby. There's a rumor of one especially off-key gardener who sang so badly that the roses in his section drooped in protest. Whether true or not, it's a story repeated whenever someone butchers a hymn during work. Historians still argue whether the palace gardens had dedicated irrigation channels designed specifically for ornamental plants, or if gardeners like you simply borrowed from the city's broader water network. Some think special rose lines were carved discreetly into palace courtyards, others suggest you filled clay jars and trudged them back manually, splashing half your cargo along the way. You, after tonight's walk, suspect it was a miserable combination of both. You lift a clay jar now, filling it from the lion's mouth. It grows heavier by the second, dragging at your shoulder. You mutter under your breath, there's no poetry in hauling 30 pounds of sloshing water through narrow paths. Still, you can't help but marvel at the ingenuity behind it all. Water guided from mountains into your humble vessel, so that a rosebud might swell and open just in time for an imperial feast. Entire engineering feats reduced to one fragrant flower on a banquet table. The jar tips slightly, spilling across your sandal. Cold rivulets snake between your toes, and you stifle a curse. Somewhere nearby, a night bird croaks as though mocking you. You set the jar down to rest and listen to the trickle beneath your feet. It's a comforting sound, steady, eternal. The roses don't know of aqueducts or cisterns, lions or pipes, they only know that water comes, and that it tastes good. Perhaps ignorance is a kind of luxury. You remember a story about Emperor Justinian, at least, the gardeners tell it often. Supposedly, he once insisted roses be kept blooming even during drought, and the overseers nearly went mad keeping up with the demand. Buckets were hauled night and day, wells drained, and one desperate gardener allegedly watered the roots with watered-down wine, claiming the roses seemed drunk with fragrance afterward. Whether that actually happened, historians still argue. But it makes for a good laugh when someone drops a jar and mutters, perhaps the emperor wants a vintage instead. The moonlight glimmers on the surface of the basin, and you imagine it as a mirror. Your face looks tired, streaked with dirt, but the roses reflected above you appear pristine, unaware of the effort that keeps them alive. You wonder if water has memory, if it carries whispers from the mountains down into your patch of earth. You whisper a secret into the basin just in case, watching ripples carry your words away. You heft the jar once more, staggering back toward the roses. Every step is careful, deliberate, as though carrying treasure. And in truth, you are. Without this flow, roses shrivel, and without roses, the palace loses its fragrance, its pageantry, its silent claim of paradise on earth. A jar of water becomes, in its way, imperial currency. You set it down at the base of a bush, tip it gently, and watch the soil drink. The ground darkens, the roots sigh. You can almost hear it, the sound of roses slaking their thirst, grateful in their wordless way. You sit back on your heels, exhausted but oddly at peace. Water has found its path, and for tonight, at least, the palace walls hum with life. The night deepens, and with it comes the moment every gardener both dreads and treasures, pruning. You step softly along the palace wall, shears at your side, the roses towering like watchful sentinels above you. Their blooms look serene, almost holy, yet you know that without careful cuts, they will tangle themselves into chaos. Roses demand discipline, and you are the one who must provide it, though not without muttering a few unholy thoughts as thorns nip at your gloves. A mainstream fact sets the stage. Byzantine sources often describe gardening as a rhythm of devotion, especially in monasteries, where pruning and tending plants were likened to cultivating the soul. In the palace, though, the same philosophy seeped in, transforming your every snip into a kind of liturgy. You can almost hear the comparison ringing in your ears: trim away the excess, remove the rot, let only the fruitful remain. Easier said than done when you're holding clunky bronze shears in the dark. You crouch beside a bush heavy with blossoms, shears squeaking faintly as you press them open. A quick slice, and a weak branch tumbles into your basket. You pause, as you always do, to whisper a short prayer. Not because you're particularly pious, but because it's the custom. Gardeners often murmur blessings before pruning, invoking saints to keep the roses healthy and, let's be honest, to keep overseers from scolding. Some swore the Virgin herself favored roses, and that to prune without prayer invited blight. You suspect the Virgin has better things to do, but better safe than itchy. The quirky tidbit. A gardener once told you that if you prune while whistling, the roses grow straighter. You tried it once, only for the overseer to accuse you of summoning pigeons. Another gardener swore that roses remember how you treat them, speak kindly, and they bloom with generosity. Curse them, and they sulk. Tonight, you compromise, whispering sweet nothings under your breath while also insulting their thorniness. Balance, you decide, is key. Historians still argue whether Byzantine gardeners followed strict horticultural manuals or mostly winged it with inherited folk wisdom. Some monasteries certainly copied ancient agricultural texts, preserving advice on when and how to prune, but palace gardeners like you suspect most of it comes down to trial, error, and the occasional divine bribe. You cut another branch, its sap sticky against your glove. The moon catches on the wet stem, turning it silver. You imagine the rose shivering, though of course that's nonsense. Still, the act feels strangely intimate, as though you've been trusted with something delicate. Each branch removed is a promise. Tomorrow, stronger shoots will grow, and the roses will stretch higher against the palace stones. You glance around, checking for the overseer. He's not here, but you picture his voice anyway. Cut too little, and the roses strangle themselves. Cut too much, and the emperor strangles you. Encouraging, really. You sigh and get back to work, your basket filling slowly with discarded stems and petals. At one bush, you hesitate. A single, perfect bud glows faintly, but the stem supporting it is weak, already leaning. Do you save the flower or cut it for the greater good? You chew your lip, knowing that if you clip it now, the palace won't have one more bloom for tomorrow's feast. But if you leave it, the plant might waste its strength. After a long breath, you snip it off, placing the bud gently in your palm. For a moment, it feels like betrayal, like ending a story before it's finished. You tuck it behind your ear, deciding it deserves at least a few hours of glory. Further along, you find a tangle of thorns gripping each other in a knotted mess. Your shears squeak and snap, and you mutter that roses are just weeds with better marketing. A thorn catches your wrist through the glove, and you hiss softly. The sting sharpens your senses, reminding you why pruning is both discipline and danger. You glance at the blood beading, shake it off, and whisper again, not a hymn this time, but a sarcastic plea. Saint Prunella, patroness of idiots with shears, please watch over me. The garden grows quieter as you work, only the faint snip-snap breaking the silence. You imagine the palace breathing with you, inhaling as you raise the shears, exhaling as you cut. It feels ritualistic, hypnotic, as though you're part of some ancient cycle older than emperors. You almost forget the aches in your shoulders, the scratches on your skin. Almost. By the time you finish, your basket is brimming with clippings. The roses look cleaner now, their lines clearer, their blooms more visible against the wall. You straighten your back and admire the effect. Not perfect, no, but then, roses never really are. Their beauty lies in being untamable, even when you pretend otherwise. You leave the basket at the base of the wall, petals spilling out like little offerings. The night air smells sharper now, green and alive, the fragrance of wounds and promises. You wipe your shears clean, slide them back into your belt, and murmur one last blessing, not for the roses this time, but for yourself. May the overseer not notice the bud tucked behind your ear. The scent hits you before you even realize what you've done. One casual brush of your sleeve against a half-open bloom, and suddenly the air is full of perfume. Rich, heady, with a sweetness that's almost dizzying, it clings to your clothes, your skin, and maybe even your thoughts. You stand still, breathing it in, and you understand why emperors demanded roses not just in gardens, but inside their palaces, woven into their very ceremonies. Mainstream fact: Byzantine records note that rose oil and petals were used liberally throughout the palace, sprinkled on banquet floors, steeped in wine, and distilled into oils that perfumed both robes and walls. The fragrance wasn't just pleasant, it was a statement. To smell of roses was to declare wealth, refinement, and a connection to paradise. Even in churches, rose scent was often released alongside incense, a reminder that heaven itself was thought to bloom with flowers. And yet, there's a quirky tidbit you can't forget. Once, a batch of rose oil went rancid in storage, filling an entire corridor with a smell closer to spoiled cabbage than paradise. Courtiers gagged, servants blamed each other, and one unfortunate eunuch supposedly fainted. Ever since, gardeners have been warned never to let rose oil sit too long in the summer heat. You make a mental note: heaven can sour quicker than you think. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines perfected the process of steam distillation for rose oil or relied on simpler methods like soaking petals in warm oil and straining them out. Some point to Arabic influences filtering into Constantinople, others insist the Romans had passed along the secret centuries earlier. Either way, the end result filled palaces with a sweetness so thick it sometimes outlasted the actual feasts. You walk closer to the palace wall, leaning against cool marble veined with faintly glowing mosaics. The patterns shimmer faintly in the torchlight, gold tiles catching every flicker. And drifting through those decorated halls is the unmistakable fragrance of roses, the same ones you've watered, pruned, and muttered over. Courtiers in silken robes pass through, wrinkling their noses delicately, discussing the superiority of rose-scented oils as if they had plucked the flowers themselves. You shake your head, amused. They wouldn't know the sting of a thorn if it bit their perfumed ankles. But their obsession with roses has consequences for you. More blooms means more work, more petals gathered, more oil pressed, more bouquets delivered before dawn. Tonight, you picture the banquet tables already being set, goblets lined up for wine spiked with rosewater. Some claim it aids digestion, others whisper it ruins it. Historians still argue which is true, though judging from the faces of drunken courtiers staggering home, you suspect digestion was rarely the main concern. You stoop and pluck a fallen petal, rubbing it between your fingers until the oil slicks your skin. The smell lingers, soft yet stubborn, like a memory that refuses to fade. You can't help but grin, imagining tomorrow's council meeting reeking faintly of roses because someone leaned too close to your handiwork. Politics and perfume, side by side. It's strange, though roses along the palace walls seem almost modest compared to what happens inside. In spring festivals, roses were scattered across moss-caked floors until they made a fragrant carpet. Courtiers walked over them with jeweled sandals, crushing beauty into dust without a second thought. You imagine the petals sighing in protest, their perfume forced upward as if pleading for mercy. Still, the effect was dazzling, overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a scented storm. You remember one ridiculous moment last year, a banquet so oversaturated with rose fragrance that a senator sneezed his wig clean off. You nearly dropped your water jar laughing, though you hid it quickly under a cough. The roses forgive, but senators don't. The wind shifts now, carrying the perfume from the wall deeper into the garden. You close your eyes and let it wash over you. It feels timeless, the kind of smell that outlives empires. Perhaps centuries from now, someone will wander these ruins and still catch a ghost of rose scent in the stones. You like that thought, that the roses remember longer than kings. You turn back to your work, brushing against another cluster just to watch the air thicken with fragrance. Your clothes are saturated now, your hair catching whiffs of sweetness every time you move. You'll smell like a walking rose bush by the time you stumble home, and your neighbors will either envy you or accuse you of bathing in perfume vats. Either way, the roses win. They always do. Their perfume sneaks past walls, past banquets, past history itself. And tonight, under the moon and the mosaics, you surrender to it, letting the scent guide your steps like an invisible hand. You balance a woven basket on your hip, the weight of it shifting with every step. Roses spill over the rim, red, pink, white, even the occasional yellow bloom smuggled in from merchants abroad. Their scent clings to you so strongly you wonder if you'll ever wash it off. Tonight, your task is clear: deliver these blossoms into the belly of the palace, where emperors and senators await their feast. A mainstream fact grounds the scene. Byzantine banquets were not simple meals but spectacles of wealth, layered with ritual and excess. Roses were scattered across tables, floated in wine bowls, even woven into garlands to crown guests of honor. It was said that to dine without roses was like entering a church without candles, possible, but miserably dull. You step through a side door into the corridors. The shift from cool garden air to the warm glow of torchlight makes you blink. Mosaic floors stretch beneath your feet, polished smooth by generations of sandals. As you pass, servants glance at your overflowing basket and raise eyebrows. Everyone knows the emperor favors roses. And everyone knows if they wilt before reaching the feast, it won't be the emperor who suffers the blame. The quirky tidbit. You once heard of a cook who tried to flavor a stew with rose petals, convinced it would please his master. Instead, the dish ended up tasting like perfume-scented broth. The poor man spent the rest of the evening scrubbing pans in shame. Still, some recipes did succeed. Candied rose petals, syrups, and rose-flavored wines were staples at court. Whether guests liked them or just pretended to, well, that remains a matter of debate. Historians still argue whether rose wine was truly a Byzantine favorite or more of an occasional curiosity. Some chronicles praise it as a luxurious indulgence, others complain it caused headaches and indigestion. You, personally, would rather not drink your work. It feels wrong to gulp down something you just spent weeks pruning and watering. The corridor hums with activity. Eunuchs in bright robes hurry past, carrying trays of figs and roasted lamb. Musicians tune their lyres in a corner, the notes clashing into nervous chaos. You catch sight of a senator adjusting his robe, his crown of roses already slipping sideways. You bite back a grin, imagine debating imperial policy with petals in your hair. At the banquet hall's entrance, you pause. The doors swing wide, and the sight nearly knocks the breath from you. Roses everywhere, scattered across the floor like spilled paint, twined along golden chalices, tucked into alcoves between frescoes of saints. The air is so thick with perfume that it almost feels chewable. Courtiers murmur politely, pretending not to notice they are practically swimming in petals. You step forward, and a steward waves you toward the high table. Carefully, you place your basket before the emperor's servants, who immediately set about weaving new garlands for the evening's highlights. A goblet is lifted, filled with wine steeped in rosewater. You remember that debate: did it soothe or ruin the stomach? Judging from the emperor's approving smile, no one dares voice the second opinion. One noble leans close to another, muttering something about whether roses in wine are a heavenly refinement or a waste of perfectly good drink. You catch the words "ruins the digestion" just before a harp strums loudly to cover it. Even among courtiers, it seems, there are whispers of doubt. As you step back, you can't help noticing how casually they handle the blossoms. A senator wipes his mouth with a rose petal as though it were a napkin. Another plucks petals from a garland and tosses them to the floor, barely glancing at the labor that went into them. You feel a flicker of irritation, quickly smoothed into resignation. To them, roses are disposable luxury. To you, they're nights of aching shoulders and scratched skin. Still, There's a strange pride in it. Every petal here passed through your hands, grew from soil you stirred, drank from water you hauled. You are invisible, yet everywhere. The emperor might never know your name, but he knows the scent you've delivered into his hall. That's something. You retreat quietly, leaving the courtiers to their feasting. As you walk back down the corridor, a lone petal drifts from your sleeve, settling on the mosaic floor. You imagine some servant tomorrow morning, sweeping it away without thought, and wonder if it will carry a trace of tonight's grandeur into the dustbin. For now, though, you breathe deep of the perfume, savoring the irony. The emperor drinks roses, the nobles wear roses, but you are roses, whether you like it or not. You slip back into the garden before dawn, your arms heavy, your tunic clinging with the faint damp of rose water and sweat. The palace has feasted all night, and by the time the last goblet was drained, the petals in your basket had nearly vanished. What's left for you now are not garlands and bouquets, but the aftermath: fallen blossoms crushed underfoot, stems bent at awkward angles, petals plastered to marble floors like wilted confetti after a parade. Mainstream fact: Byzantine celebrations, especially during major feast days or imperial victories, were notorious for leaving behind staggering amounts of floral waste. Courtyards and banquet halls would be knee-deep in petals by the time the sun rose, a sight both decadent and strangely melancholic. Roses, prized symbols of eternity, looked pitiful in defeat after a single night of indulgence. You've seen it before. Servants with brooms and buckets sweep the palace corridors, shoving piles of petals into corners, muttering about their ruined shoes. Some petals stick stubbornly to the soles of sandals, leaving faint, fragrant footprints long after the mess is cleared. One rumor you heard claimed a senator slipped on a rose-strewn stair and tumbled halfway down, his dignity bruised worse than his body. The joke lingered far longer than the petals themselves. The quirky tidbit that comes to mind tonight is that some of these leftover roses weren't simply discarded. Gardeners, thrifty in their own quiet way, gathered the best of the survivors, drying them for potpourri or steeping them into soaps and ointments. Imagine that the same roses that crowned an emperor one evening might end up perfuming a laundress's bathwater weeks later. Recycling, Byzantine style. Still, historians argue whether such practices were widespread or just the desperate habits of underpaid staff. Some insist palace roses were far too sacred for reuse, destined only for disposal. Others point to merchant accounts describing bundles of second-hand petals being sold cheaply at markets. You can't help but wonder if the truth lies somewhere in between, as truths usually do. You crouch now at the base of the palace wall, brushing away petals matted to the stones. Some are still fragrant, as though unwilling to surrender. Others have already gone brown, curling at the edges like old parchment. The moonlight softens their decay, turning even ruin into a kind of beauty. You pause, half tempted to pocket a few survivors, though you know your satchel is already full from the night's labor. The task stretches on. You shake petals from the edges of irrigation channels, fish them out of fountains where they drift like tiny drowned ships, and sweep them into heaps. The garden smells overwhelmingly sweet, almost cloying now, as though paradise has overstayed its welcome. You sneeze once, twice, wiping your nose on your sleeve. Imagine trying to explain to a courtier that even heaven can trigger allergies. Your mind wanders to the absurd. Somewhere, a historian centuries later will probably write that roses never went to waste in Byzantium, that every petal was honored and preserved. You'd laugh if you weren't too tired. You've seen the piles yourself, shoveled into corners like yesterday's fish bones. History may gild the truth, but your hands always remember the dirtier details. As dawn approaches, the sky pales, and you notice the way petals cling to the dew, each drop of water turning them into jeweled scraps. For a moment, you forget the aches in your shoulders, the blisters on your palms. The garden, even in its messy aftermath, is breathtaking. Roses refuse to leave without a final bow. You sweep slower now, less urgently, as though savoring the silence after the chaos. The laughter and clinking goblets of the feast are gone, only the faint rustle of petals remains. You're the last witness, the quiet custodian of what luxury leaves behind. And when the sun finally breaches the horizon, gilding the palace walls, you stand back and look at the cleared paths. The roses are gone from the banquet hall, but not from the air, not from your skin, not from the stones that will smell faintly of them long after the petals have turned to dust. You sigh, leaning on your broom like a weary general surveying the battlefield. Victory and ruin, all in a single night, and you, as always, tasked with sweeping up the empire's leftovers. The day wears on, and your work doesn't end with feasts or petals. Roses may seem immortal when they bloom in profusion along the palace walls, but the truth is, they're fragile creatures, constantly under siege. By midday, you've traded garlands and sweeping for something less glamorous: pest patrol. Mainstream fact: Byzantine gardeners were skilled not only at cultivation but also at defense. Insects, mildew, and fungi were relentless enemies of the rose. Ancient treatises, some inherited from Greek and Roman traditions, mention concoctions of ash, vinegar, garlic, and even fish brine being spread across leaves to discourage pests. You, too, carry your satchel of odd remedies, each smelling worse than the last. You dip a rag into a bucket of sour-smelling solution and dab it onto leaves where aphids cluster like tiny emerald thieves. You mutter under your breath, half a prayer, half a complaint. The aphids don't answer, but a nearby cat, lounging in the sun, looks deeply unimpressed. And here comes the quirky tidbit: some gardeners swore by hanging strips of donkey fat or sheep's wool among the branches to repel insects. You've tried it once. The result? A garden that smelled like a butcher's stall, driving away not only pests but also any guest who came too close. Still, the roses thrived, and the emperor never knew why his beloved wall of flowers reeked faintly of barnyard. Historians still argue whether Byzantine gardeners relied more heavily on herbal remedies or animal byproducts in their pest control. Some surviving manuals describe elaborate plant-based potions, while others mention unsavory mixtures that would make even a rat gag. You lean toward the latter being true, because you've stirred enough of these buckets yourself to know that sometimes the cure is worse than the plague. Your hands itch as you smear garlic paste along a row of stems. The scent clings to your skin until it mingles with rose perfume, creating an aroma no poet will ever celebrate. You joke to yourself that if roses symbolize love, garlic symbolizes keeping the in-laws away. But pest control isn't just about smells. You also wage a quieter war with the weather. Too much rain, and mildew creeps in like an uninvited guest. Too much sun, and the leaves shrivel like old parchment. Tonight, you adjust the lattice coverings along the palace wall, pulling woven mats across the tenderest blooms. They'll never thank you, but they might just survive another season. You pause to inspect one rosebud, just opening, its petals spiraling outward in perfect symmetry. The sight almost erases the stink of your remedies. Almost. You lean closer, squinting at a speck crawling along the edge. Another aphid. With a weary sigh, you pinch it away, muttering that the empire may rise and fall, but bugs never seem to lose their grip on power. A memory drifts back. A courtier once asked why roses sometimes had spotted leaves. You explained mildew. He blinked, then asked why mildew existed at all. You nearly told him, to torment gardeners. Instead, you mumbled something about divine balance and hurried away. Philosophers can argue the meaning of mildew, you'll just keep scrubbing it off the leaves. By late afternoon, the garden is quieter. Birds hop along the walls, eyeing the insects you've disturbed, plucking them away like opportunistic allies. You smile, perhaps not all battles are fought alone. The sun glints off the marble mosaics of the palace, and for a moment, You see your reflection faintly warped in the polished stones. Your tunic is stained, your hair full of stray petals, your hands reeking of garlic and vinegar. If this is paradise, it's paradise with blisters. Still, you straighten your back, satisfied. The roses glisten faintly in the waning light, their leaves glossy, their petals unblemished. For all the stink, the sweat, the indignity of hanging donkey fat on branches, the results are undeniable. The palace walls remain crowned with beauty, and no one outside this garden will ever suspect the wars fought to keep it so. You wipe your hands on your tunic, sighing. Tomorrow, the pests will return. They always do. Empires crumble, palaces burn, but aphids? Eternal. You almost laugh at the thought, shaking your head as you turn back toward the tool shed. And as you glance once more at the roses, you admit quietly to yourself, you wouldn't trade this battle for another. The pests keep you humble, the roses keep you proud, and somewhere in between lies the strange, fragrant truth of your days. The night is cooler now, and the palace walls shimmer in the torchlight as you make your way along the garden paths. Your arms ache from the day's battles with pests and mildew, but there's no rest yet. Tonight's duty is older than you, older than the palace itself, tending the water. Mainstream fact: Byzantine gardens were sustained by elaborate irrigation systems, many adapted from Roman engineering. Clay pipes ran under the soil, channels directed water from cisterns, and fountains doubled as both decoration and distribution. Without these, roses would wither in the summer heat. The palace walls, gleaming with mosaics, might look eternal, but the flowers at their base lived only because water obeyed human hands. You stoop to adjust a narrow stone channel, guiding the trickle toward a patch of thirsty rose bushes. The sound of water running over stone is strangely calming, like a lullaby only the garden can hear. You dip your fingers in, splash your face, and taste the faint metallic tang of the cistern. Cold, refreshing, but tinged with the labor of men who hauled it from underground vaults. Here's the quirky tidbit: some gardeners swore by whispering blessings into the water before letting it flow into the soil. A muttered prayer to the Virgin, a quiet charm against drought. It hardly mattered what words were used, as long as the roses got their share. You've done it yourself, whispering nonsense once just to see if anyone noticed. They didn't, but the roses bloomed anyway, as though humoring your joke. Historians still argue whether the palace gardens had access to aqueduct-fed water throughout the centuries or relied increasingly on local cisterns as the empire's infrastructure weakened. Some claim the rose walls were always lush, others suspect there were long dry spells where gardeners carried jars by hand, sweating under the sun while courtiers complained of wilting garlands. You know which version feels true, because your shoulders still ache from lugging buckets more than once when the channel's clogged. You walk along the edge of the wall, checking each outlet. Water trickles here, pools there, sometimes stubbornly refuses to move at all. With a practiced kick, you clear a blockage, sending a rush forward that splashes over your sandals. You sigh in relief. Better wet feet than dry roses. The palace at night hums faintly in the background, distant lyres, muffled laughter, the scrape of sandals across marble. But out here, it's just you, the water, and the roses. You imagine the flowers sighing as their roots drink deep, their petals lifting slightly as though stretching after a long nap. One memory surfaces: a eunuch once insisted roses bloom better when watered with wine instead of water. You laughed until you realized he was serious. The thought of pouring amphora after amphora of expensive vintage onto dirt still makes you chuckle. Imagine explaining to the emperor that his treasury is empty because the roses were thirsty. You lean on the handle of your spade, watching as the channels glimmer in the moonlight. Reflections ripple across the water, distorted shapes of roses and stars mingling. For a moment, you feel like the garden is both grounded and floating, rooted in soil yet drifting across the heavens. Water, you realize, is more than sustenance, it's a mirror, catching fragments of eternity between trickles. The truth is, the roses demand attention as much as any emperor. Too little water, and they sulk. Too much, and they drown. You've learned to read them like courtiers read faces, every droop, every blush of leaf, every unexpected silence in their blooming. They tell you what they need, and you obey. Not because you must, but because without them, the palace walls would be bare stone, stripped of their soft crown. By the time you finish adjusting the last channel, the stars have shifted higher, and the air smells faintly of damp earth mixed with perfume. Your sandals squelch as you step back, mud streaking your ankles, but you don't mind. The roses glisten, their petals jeweled with droplets, and the palace looks less like a fortress, more like a sanctuary wrapped in scent and sound. You lean against the wall, closing your eyes, listening to the trickle of water fading into the distance. A thought lingers. Perhaps one day, when emperors are forgotten and palaces lie in ruin, someone will stumble across these channels, broken and dry, and wonder what they once carried. Will they guess the truth, that roses once drank here, that hands like yours guided the flow, that beauty itself depended on mud, sweat, and whispered prayers? You chuckle softly, pushing away the melancholy. For now, the channels still run, the roses still drink, and your job is not finished. You push yourself upright, wipe your muddy hands on your tunic, and head toward the next patch of blooms. The empire may stand or fall, but tonight, at least, the roses will not go thirsty. The garden is never entirely yours. Even at night, when the torches burn low and the palace halls fall into uneasy quiet, there are always eyes. You feel them now as you crouch by the roses, trimming a crooked stem, someone watching from the shadow of a balcony, or perhaps just the whisper of history itself leaning over your shoulder. Mainstream fact: in Byzantium, palace gardens were not just places of beauty but also spaces of surveillance. Eunuchs, guards, and even imperial spies were known to linger among the hedges. The emperor's court thrived on whispers, and what better place to overhear secrets than in a perfumed corner where courtiers thought themselves safe? Roses, it seems, had ears. You know this too well. More than once, you've stumbled upon murmured plots, senators muttering about taxes, nobles whispering about favors, even a scandal or two involving who wore whose garland a little too fondly. You always pretended to be deaf, your head bowed, your shears busy. After all, a gardener who hears too much might not wake the next morning. Here's the quirky tidbit. One rumor claims the roses themselves carried gossip. Not literally, of course, but petals plucked from palace walls were sometimes passed in secret as tokens of conspiracy. A senator handing a rose to an ally wasn't offering romance, it was a silent promise of shared intent. Imagine that, your painstakingly pruned blooms serving as messengers in games of intrigue. Historians still argue whether Byzantine gardeners were ever officially employed as informants. Some chroniclers suggest they were invisible enough to be perfect spies. Others dismiss the idea, noting that gardeners had more than enough to do without reporting on who kissed whom under the arches. You, personally, have no desire to be part of that debate. Spying doesn't pay nearly as well as pruning, at least, not if you want to live long enough to see your next bloom. Still, you can't shake the unease. Every time you kneel near the palace wall, your ears catch whispers you wish you hadn't. Tonight, a pair of courtiers stroll nearby, their sandals crunching softly on gravel. Their voices drift faintly, something about a tax levy, something about the emperor's health. You focus hard on your roses, pretending the only thing you hear is the snip of your shears. Yet the words cling, like thorns lodged under the skin. Once, you even saw an imperial guard pluck a rose, sniff it dramatically, and tuck it into his belt as he leaned to murmur to a senator. You wondered if the gesture was code, or just vanity. Either way, you noted the irony: roses, tools of beauty, doubling as props in political theater. The roses don't care. They bloom, they shed petals, They cling to the palace wall as if history itself is their trellis. You envy them sometimes, their ability to be present without consequence, admired but never truly accused. If only gardeners could claim the same immunity. You remember the advice of an older gardener, long gone now: keep your head down, boy. Roses listen, but they don't repeat. Be like the roses. At the time, you laughed. Now, you realize it was survival advice disguised as poetry. The moon slips from behind a cloud, painting the wall with silver. You straighten your back, scanning the balconies. A shadow stirs, but whether it's a spy, a eunuch, or simply a trick of the torchlight, you cannot tell. Your heart beats faster anyway. You turn back to the roses, forcing calm into your movements. Snip, gather, step back. Your mind drifts to the absurd again. Imagine historians centuries later writing that roses in Byzantium kept secrets safe. You'd roll your eyes in your grave. Secrets were never safe. They were just buried under petals, waiting for someone foolish enough to dig. Still, as the night deepens, you find a strange comfort in the rhythm of your work. The whispers fade into background noise, the shadows stretch long and thin, and the roses remain your constant. Whatever games play out in the palace above, down here it is always soil, water, thorns, and bloom. And when you finally set down your shears, brushing stray petals from your lap, you think, perhaps that's why the empire keeps its gardeners close. Not for spying, not for politics, but because amid the endless noise of ambition, someone must remain loyal to beauty alone. The roses are never silent. By day they sway with the chatter of bees, by night they hum with the wind. And always, they carry stories not just whispered by courtiers, but woven into the empire's own tapestry. Tonight, as you lean against the cool palace wall, you catch yourself drifting into memory, thinking of how these flowers have bloomed not just for emperors, but for legends. Mainstream fact: Byzantine poets and chroniclers often likened roses to the Virgin Mary, calling her the unfading rose in hymns that still echo through churches. The blossom became more than a garden treasure, it was a symbol of purity, triumph, and eternity. Roses wove themselves into religion, politics, and personal devotion alike, appearing in mosaics, manuscripts, and liturgies. You brush your fingers over a pale white bloom, almost glowing in the moonlight, and imagine the hymn rising in a distant church: "Rejoice, O unfading rose." It's strange to think the same flower that perfumes an emperor's banquet also crowns the Virgin in the minds of priests. Roses move seamlessly between the sacred and the mundane, like diplomats that never trip over their sandals. And here's the quirky tidbit. One half-forgotten story claims an emperor once tried to cultivate a rose that never wilted, believing it would prove his divine right to rule. Of course, the poor plant shriveled after a week, leaving him furious. Servants scrambled to replace it with fresh cuttings each morning, keeping the illusion alive for visiting dignitaries. You almost admire the effort. Nothing says immortal empire quite like a carefully hidden compost pile. Historians still argue whether Byzantines truly believed roses held mystical powers beyond symbolism. Some claim roses were pressed into talismans or carried as charms against illness. Others dismiss these tales as exaggerations by later writers. You've never seen a rose cure a fever, though you've seen plenty of courtiers sniff them theatrically as if inhaling holiness itself. You wander further along the wall, where the older roses grow gnarled and thick, their roots burrowed deep into soil touched by centuries of footsteps. You imagine emperors long dead pausing here, hands brushing petals that felt exactly as they do now. The thought is dizzying. Roses outlast rulers, even outlast memory. The palace itself seems to know this. Carvings of roses appear on stone arches, painted blossoms climb across faded frescoes, and golden roses gleam in mosaics above chapel doors. Walk through any corridor, and you'll find petals etched into the empire's very skin. It's as if the rulers, unsure of their own permanence, tried to borrow eternity from the flower. You smile at the irony. Emperors needed armies and fortresses to hold power, roses just needed soil and sunlight. Yet which has survived more gently in the minds of poets? Which has wrapped itself in hymn and memory? If the empire falls tomorrow, someone will still write about roses. Your thoughts wander to the odd overlap between your work and myth. When guests see roses scattered across a feast or hear them praised in song, they imagine magic, holiness, grandeur. But you know the truth is far earthier: soil under nails, dung in the compost, donkey fat swinging in branches to keep bugs away. The poetry glosses over the sweat. Maybe that's the point. History always prefers perfume to garlic paste. You laugh softly, startling a bird from a nearby branch. It flutters upward, scattering a handful of petals into the night air. They drift down like tiny prayers, each one glowing briefly before melting into the shadows. You think of the Virgin's title again, unfading rose, and can't help but joke inwardly. Clearly, the hymn writers never met a real gardener. Every rose fades, eventually. And yet, somehow, the symbol never does. Your basket is lighter tonight, the petals fewer, but the weight of their meaning is heavier than ever. Roses have been saints, lovers, conspirators, and courtiers. They've been feasts, prayers, and even lies. You tend them quietly, trimming and watering, knowing each bloom carries more stories than you'll ever be able to count. And as you move toward the next row, you whisper something, not quite a prayer, not quite a joke. Stay a little longer, won't you? The roses don't answer, but a breeze stirs their petals as if in reply. By the time dawn seeps through the garden again, your hands are raw, and your knees ache from hours of crouching. The roses glisten with dew, each droplet catching the first pale rays of light, but you know the beauty hides another truth: the wall itself is weary. Cracks run through its marble base, weeds creep between the stones, and even the roses sometimes struggle against the empire's slow crumbling. Mainstream fact: by the later centuries of Byzantium, resources stretched thin. Palaces aged without proper repairs, aqueducts crumbled, and gardens were sometimes maintained more for appearances than genuine splendor. Yet emperors still demanded roses, proof that the empire was eternal, even if scaffolding told a different story just out of sight. You run your palm over the wall, feeling where plaster has flaked away. Some sections are patched with mismatched stone, others darkened by soot. The roses climb bravely over these scars, their thorns gripping whatever they can find. You can't help but see the symbolism: roses covering wounds the empire would rather not admit. And here's the quirky tidbit: a rumor once spread that when the walls of Constantinople trembled during an earthquake, the roses along the palace wall bloomed overnight, twice as many as usual. People claimed it was a miracle, proof that heaven still favored the city. You laugh softly, remembering the story. You suspect the gardeners had just been overzealous with manure the week before. Historians still argue whether the later Byzantine emperors truly maintained their gardens with the same devotion as their predecessors, or simply ordered roses for ceremonies, leaving the walls to decay in between. Some records describe lavish displays, others mention withered blooms and neglected plots. The truth likely depended on the treasury's mood and which emperor woke up craving perfume that morning. You crouch now by a cluster of roses fighting for space in a crack at the wall's base. They look fragile, yet their roots have found strength where stone itself is weak. You pluck a stray weed from their midst and shake your head. If only emperors were as stubborn as roses. The garden feels quieter than usual, almost melancholy. Maybe it's the faint groan of shifting stone, or the way petals scatter too easily on the wind. You picture future centuries, strangers wandering through ruins, finding only fragments of mosaic and wild roses reclaiming what was once cultivated. It's a sobering thought: your careful pruning, your whispered charms, your endless buckets of water, all swallowed by time. Yet even as the idea weighs on you, a strange comfort settles in. The roses don't worry about empires. They don't measure history by dynasties, only by seasons. They bloom, they fade, they bloom again. Their eternity is not marble permanence, but repetition. Perhaps that's the secret emperors never understood. You lean back, gazing at the wall. Above you, golden tiles shimmer faintly in the morning light, saints frozen in mosaic halos. Below, roses nod their heads, heavy with dew. Together, they form a strange dialogue, stone and flower, permanence and fragility, empire and earth. And you, the gardener, sit somewhere in between, tasked with holding both worlds together for just a little longer. A memory tugs at you. An older courtier once scoffed that roses were a waste, that soldiers, not flowers, defended a city. Yet when he died, a garland of roses was placed on his coffin. You smile at the irony. In the end, even skeptics return to the petals. The sun climbs higher, burning away the dew, and the roses shake themselves awake. You stretch your aching back, brush the dirt from your knees, and think, the wall may crack, the empire may falter, but as long as a gardener still lugs water and whispers to roots, roses will climb the stones. Maybe that's enough. The sun rides higher now, beating down on the stone wall and warming the roses until their fragrance thickens in the air. The garden is alive with bees, with birds, and with your own half-tired humming. You know the rhythm of these tasks so well, trimming here, watering there, muttering under your breath when a thorn catches your sleeve. But today, the work feels heavier, as though you are carrying not just petals, but centuries. Mainstream fact: Byzantine palace gardens were more than just ornament, they were settings for diplomacy, quiet negotiations, and even betrayals. More than one deal for power was struck under the shadow of climbing roses, with petals falling silently onto the robes of men who would later betray one another. Gardens, after all, make excellent cover for secrets. You can almost hear the whispers of long-gone courtiers echoing between the leaves. Their perfume masks their lies, their sandals brush softly over the gravel paths. You imagine them leaning close, pretending to admire a rose while plotting someone's downfall. It makes you smirk. Here you are, breaking your back with compost, while roses quietly host half the empire's treachery. And here's the quirky tidbit. A story tells of one emperor who trusted roses so much, he believed they listened. He ordered his gardeners never to gossip near them, fearing the flowers might repeat words to his rivals. Absurd, yes, but you've seen courtiers act more paranoid than emperors. Maybe roses were the least of their worries. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine elite saw these palace gardens as genuine places of retreat or merely backdrops for ceremony. Some claim emperors genuinely sought solace here, escaping court tensions. Others argue the gardens were little more than stage sets, designed to impress foreign envoys. Either way, the roses played their role beautifully, dressing both sincerity and spectacle in the same bloom. You pause by a particularly stubborn rose, one that insists on climbing higher than the rest. Its thorny arm has gripped a crack in the wall and is reaching almost daringly toward the parapet. You grin. If this rose were a courtier, it would be an ambitious one, always aiming for the emperor's ear. You prune it gently, reminding it not to climb too fast, as if it might burn itself out on ambition. As you work, you reflect on your strange place in this empire. You don't draft laws, you don't command armies, you don't negotiate treaties. You prune, water, dig, and sprinkle donkey fat. Yet here in the garden, you feel closer to truth than most of the people bustling in marble halls. The roses never lie, they only bloom and fade again. A petal drifts down, landing on your wrist. For a moment, you imagine it as a seal, like the wax stamps emperors press into documents. Except this one seals nothing but a moment, fragile, fleeting, fragrant. You chuckle to yourself. Not the kind of contract historians will dig up in the archives. You straighten, wiping sweat from your brow, and watch the bees swarm lazily between blossoms. To them, your empire is irrelevant. Their empire is pollen, their wars are fought on stamen and petal. They are indifferent to emperors, dynasties, or walls. And still, their buzzing stitches the air together more faithfully than any court decree. By afternoon, the light shifts, throwing long shadows across the wall. You take in the view one more time, roses of every shade, bright against the pale stone, clinging stubbornly to the palace like a crown made of thorns and silk at once. The empire may wobble, conspiracies may fester, emperors may fall, but the roses endure, holding their station like the quietest, most steadfast courtiers of all. And you, the gardener, nod to yourself. Tomorrow will bring the same chores, the same thorns, the same stubborn climbing branch. You wouldn't have it any other way. Evening sinks gently over the palace, and you find yourself slowing, tools heavy in your hands, knees stiff from the long day. The roses are glowing softly in the dusk, their colors muted but not diminished, as though they've drawn the last light of the sun into their petals. It feels almost like they are sighing with you, both gardener and garden exhaling together after centuries of holding up this wall. Mainstream fact: when Byzantium finally collapsed in 1453, gardens like these were among the first spaces to be transformed. The Ottoman conquerors adopted, reshaped, and expanded the rose tradition, carrying forward what Byzantine gardeners had cultivated. Roses became as central to Ottoman symbolism as they had once been to the empire of Constantine. Your work, it seems, was never wasted, it just kept blooming in another dynasty's soil. And here's the quirky tidbit. Later chroniclers claimed that on the night before Constantinople fell, the roses along the palace walls bloomed one last time, out of season, as if in farewell. Whether it was poetic invention or a trick of memory, it's the kind of story you can't help but savor. Even defeat, apparently, deserved roses. Historians still argue whether these tales of miraculous blooms are allegory or eyewitness accounts. Some insist the accounts were romanticized centuries later, while others maintain that gardeners like you might have nurtured late blossoms with quiet determination, hoping beauty could hold the city together one more day. You know better than most that roses can't stop an army, but maybe they can give courage to someone who needs it. You gather your tools, brush dirt from your palms, and take one last slow walk along the wall. The roses brush against your sleeves, catching on the rough fabric, almost as though they don't want to let you go. You smile at the thought, remembering all the small labors, the water buckets, the manure, the jokes whispered under your breath when no one was looking. You've stitched yourself into their story as much as they've stitched themselves into the empire's. The garden is quiet now, save for the hum of crickets. You feel the pull of sleep in your bones, the kind that seeps deep after long work. You pause, hand resting on one last bloom, and whisper, "Rest well. We'll do this again tomorrow." And then the world begins to soften. The tools are set aside, the wall fades into shadow, and the roses become little more than silhouettes against the night sky. Their fragrance still lingers, sweet and steady, as though the garden itself is whispering a lullaby to anyone willing to stop and listen. You let your breathing match their rhythm, slow, steady, unhurried, until even the ache in your body feels gentler. Imagine the petals folding inward, one by one, like tired eyelids closing at the end of a long day. Imagine the garden quieting, not because it has been abandoned, but because it has earned its rest. Every sound softens, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, even the faint creak of the wall as stone cools under the night air. Each noise stretches out, slower and slower, until silence begins to hum. The empire, the court, the endless demands of emperors, they all shrink away now. What remains is only you, the roses, and the night. The stars are patient witnesses, scattered far above, while the earth beneath you holds steady, strong enough to cradle your weight, strong enough to let you release every last thought. There is no need to hurry, no need to prune, no need to water. Time itself slows here. The roses will wait. The wall will wait. And you, too, can simply rest. So close your eyes, let the scent of roses drift further into your dreams, and trust that when you wake, the garden will still be here, waiting to bloom again. Good night, and sleep deeply.